This video comes from Called to Believe Chapter 2 and covers the topic of natural arguments for the existence of God, or classical theism arguments. You'll see on the screen here a list. First up, it says ontological argument, then cosmological argument, teleological argument, moral argument, experiential argument, historical argument, and then I just put and more because there are others. For example, the argument from beauty, sometimes called the aesthetic argument. Let's go through each of these one at a time. But before I tell you what each argument is, understand what each argument is trying to do. None of these are trying to prove Christianity. None of these are trying to prove that Jesus is God. These are theism arguments. So anybody who believes that there is a God, generally one creator God, could use these arguments if they believe in God. If you're a Muslim who believes in one God, you might use the cosmological argument, and they do, right? So these arguments try to prove theism, not necessarily Christian theism. There are other arguments that very well prove, I think, Christian theism. All right, ontological argument. I'll spend the least amount of time on this one. I think it's only for people who really love logic, but Anselm of Canterbury gets credit for this one, I think 1100s roughly AD. And it's this idea that God is that than which nothing greater can be conceived, right? So God is like this maximally great being that we can conceive of, that we can imagine. The idea doesn't have to come from the outside in, the idea of a God, it's just there, this maximally great being. And Anselm argues that if this innate conceived idea of a maximally great being is there, and it's greater to exist than not to exist, because if you can believe in a maximally great being just in your imagination, well, then one who exists not only in your imagination but also in reality would be an even more maximally great being. And ultimately he argues that if such a great being could exist in any possible world, then he could exist in all possible worlds. All right, so it's an argument that has gotten a lot of attack. It's a little bit difficult to understand, and for that reason, I would never use this argument in conversation with someone to try to demonstrate why I think it is reasonable to believe in a God. But it is an interesting argument that many people have furrowed their brows over and spent a lot of time thinking through. This idea that God is a necessary being, as the being than which nothing greater can be conceived. Let's move on to the next one. The cosmological argument oftentimes is credited to Aquinas. He did not invent it, but he argued it rather powerfully, and that's why sometimes we connect him to it. But some of the Greek philosophers used this kind of argument to believe in some sort of divine spirit. But the cosmological argument essentially says that the cosmos, the universe, can't have come from nowhere, right? The cosmos must actually exist. Because the cosmos exists, there must be something that caused it to exist, right? So it's this idea that everything that we experience in the world has a cause. Well, what caused the universe, we might say? What caused the cosmos? It can't have come from nothing, right? So the cosmological argument is simply that because there's a universe, there must be a universe creator. Now, some people will say, well, yeah, but what if it was just a big explosion that got it started? That doesn't answer the question. Where did the material for the big explosion come from? That's what the cosmological argument is getting at. Even if you posit a Big Bang as our beginnings, well, what began it? Where'd that stuff come from that was a Big Bang, supposedly, right? So the cosmological argument says the universe requires a sufficient cause, and that means some sort of all-powerful God. What else could cause a universe? Teleological argument I also like. Instead of the Greek word cosmos for cosmos, the world, this is the Greek word telos for purpose, the completion of a thing, the end of a thing, the final purpose of a thing. And what it's noting is not the existence of the universe, but the design in it. In other words, when we look at the universe, both at the macro level, the arrangement of our solar system, or the micro level, just the arrangement of atoms and molecules and DNA, which seems so very much to be information telling a cell what kind of cell it's going to be in this larger organism, in my case, a human being, that none of this is random or chaotic or disorderly. It is ordered. like a brilliant mind designed it. And instead of saying because there is a universe, there must be a universe creator, cosmological argument, this one says because there is design in the universe, there must be a universe designer, teleological argument. I like this one a lot. I think it works rather well, and you hear a variety of versions of this argument for why there must be a God, the teleological argument. The moral argument. This one argues that because everybody has this sense of morality. We don't believe behavior is just behavior. We think behavior has a potentially moral nature to it. We think action can be appropriate or inappropriate. We think action can be good or evil. And even if we disagree on what is good or what is evil, we do tend to agree that the categories exist. Good is a real category. Evil is a real category. And if you reject these categories, there's actually serious consequences when you start to think through a worldview that rejects good and evil entirely. So because it seems to be universally built into the human mind, this idea of morality, these categories of good action, good thought, evil thought, and so on, this seems to suggest that there must be a source that put this universally in our mind. Otherwise, it wouldn't be there. It wouldn't just spontaneously spawn in all of our minds that action is either good or evil. But we do have a conscience. We do have this sense of morality. We do have these categories of right and wrong, good and evil. And this suggests that we were all designed by the same being who gave us these categories, who created in us a conscience, who made us think in terms of right and wrong, good and evil. Even if because of sin we argue over what is right or what is wrong, those categories are still there. That is a moral argument. If there seems to be this universal law that we all hold, there must be a divine universal law creator, law giver, and we would call him God. All right, experiential argument. This one, in short, essentially says lots and lots of people have said they've experienced God. People will say, I've heard from God, I've felt God. I had an experience in my life that I cannot explain unless there is a God and he intervened in that experience. I have no natural explanation for what happened to me or whatever it may be. This is the experiential argument. There is not one or two people that talk this way. There are so many people throughout world history that have talked about these experiences that they could only attribute to God. So this is a very personal argument for some people for why they believe in a God. The historical argument, not to be confused with the evidential argument, is that there seems to be a divine hand guiding human history. When we look at human history, it's like a story. And if there's a story, someone's telling the story. Right? So that's the historical argument, that history doesn't seem to be guided by and decided by the decisions of creatures like you and me. There seems to be decisions of a greater mind, a divine mind, guiding this story of the world. That's the historical argument. Not to be confused with the evidential argument that says if you look at the evidence about this person, Jesus Christ, the evidence points to him being divine, so therefore there is a God because he is that God. That's a different argument altogether and a very important one, but this one we just call the historical argument.